Today, together with the Oxford China Forum, the Oxford PPE Society is hosting the renowned Professor Rana Mitter, former director of the Oxford China Forum and a publisher of numerous accounts of Chinese history. And today we'll be talking about his book, China's Good War, How World War II is Shaping New Nationalism. And quickly give an introduction to ourselves. My name is Mika Eric. I'm the president of the PPE Society. And I'm now handing over quickly to Yizhou Wang from the Oxford China Forum, and then over to Professor Mitter.
Thank you, Mika. So please allow me also to introduce myself. My name is Yizhou, and I am the vice president of Oxford China Forum. And a very short intro of OCF. So Oxford China Forum is founded in 2013, and it's one of the largest student-run annual conference aimed at providing insights into modern China in Europe. And in addition to the annual forum, we also run multiple individual events each term, covering wide ranges of topics related to contemporary China. So please follow our Facebook page and stay updated about our latest events. And now hand it over back to Mika.
Thank you, Yizhou. And without further ado, I would just like to give Professor Mitter the opportunity to give a quick introduction to his book and talk about the theme of this new nationalism he's exploring there.
Thanks very much indeed. Thank you to Mika Eric for hosting this event on behalf of the PPE Society, and thank you to Yizhou for hosting it on behalf of the OCF. Since I have for many years been a PPE tutor, I'm delighted to have that side of me paying tribute today, although I'm currently actually on research leave, so not teaching Chinese politics this year. And having spoken at several editions of the Oxford China Forum, it's very nice to join you online at a time when, sadly for the moment, we can't gather in person for the forum. What I'm going to do today is to speak for about half an hour or so with the kind invitation of both these organizations about the subject of the book that I've recently published, just to give you a flash of that here. China's Good War, How World War II is Shaping a New Nationalism. I want to introduce a little bit one of the themes within that book, but I want to also leave some time at the end, so we should have about 20-25 minutes, I hope, for questions, bringing us up to about 7 o'clock. And very happy to take questions on the talk. Also, some people may have questions that are kind of beyond that, and I'm very happy to take those too. I can promise to try and answer your questions, but I can't promise to have the answers. But before we get anywhere with that, I wanted to start by hoping that the technology will work and showing you some images. So let's see if I can share my screen. Yes, I think that's going to work. Lovely. Okay, and I'm going to assume that if my screen stops or you can't see anything that you should be seeing, either Yizhou or Mika Eric will dive in. But if I don't hear anything from either of you two, then I'll assume that I can be heard and things are going as they should be. So let me use this image, if I may, to take you back to a time when, if you're currently an undergraduate at Oxford, as I imagine many of you listening to this are, then you were probably thinking more about your transition to your secondary school than you were to undergraduate activities, because this was a television program that came out just over 10 years ago in the year 2010. You may not have seen it, so just to let you know what it's about, it was released in America through the HBO channel. It's called The Pacific. It's basically a 10-part series about US Marines in World War II, fighting in the Pacific Theater, produced by a massive Hollywood power team in the shape of Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks. Okay, so that's item number one. Item number two, this one here. And again, I don't know how many of you would have been watching movies like this 10 or 11 years ago, maybe not so many, but just in case, this was a movie that was released in China in exactly the same year, in the year 2010. It's called Dongfeng Yu, East Wind Rain, and it's a fun watch. If you haven't seen it, it's basically a thriller set around the time of Pearl Harbor, 1941. And it tells the story of how a sort of secret underground group of Chinese spies find out that the Japanese are about to attack the Americans at Pearl Harbor, and they even managed to get the information through to President Roosevelt, but being kind of unwilling to take advice, he refuses to listen and of course Pearl Harbor is bombed and attacked, as we know. But the message is that he should have listened to the Chinese intelligence agents. So it's not particularly coded, you might say. So I wanted to flag up, as I say, these two items: this television program from America and this Chinese movie, both of which were products of that year 2010. Now, why am I mentioning both of these, and what is the wider theme? Let me stop sharing for a minute. I'll come back to the images in a second and just read a little bit about these films to you. So in that same year, one of the, at the time, better known bloggers in China, some of you, if you're followers of Chinese social media, may know him. He goes by the name of Summa Pingbang, quite well-known neo-Maoist, leftist commentator on the Chinese internet. And he and a co-author wrote an essay, a very interesting essay, quite a long essay, online in China about both of these shows, TV show and the movie. And Summa Pingbang and his co-author, who goes by the pseudonym Mingbo Shalong, asks, why are China and the United States both rewriting the history of the Pacific War, meaning the Pacific theater of World War II? And it's, as I say, a long essay, so I won't go into all the details here, but basically they look at what, you know, these sort of heroes, Chinese heroes in the Chinese movie, American heroes in the American TV show, do during this wartime period. And they come to a conclusion. So they say on this blog, if you peel below the surface of these stories of justice and heroism, then there's a bit of a tendency towards conspiracy and competition in their own interests. And by doing this, they say on the American show, that is the Pacific, the HBO show, they argue that, quote, this series says, because the Americans saved people from the claws of the demon Japanese, is a term that they use, I'm afraid, that's why the US now gets to have the strongest army in the world. And they also examine Dongfeng Yu, the East Wind Rain, the Chinese movie, and say that it's trying to give China the upper hand rhetorically by suggesting that Pearl Harbor was an American failure that could have been solved by heeding Chinese advice. But I have to say, for the historical record, there is absolutely no record that there was any secret information from China or anyone else to America about Pearl Harbor. It's great for a movie, but it's not actually based in historical fact, I should say. But that's not the point. The point is why these two movies got released at that particular time. And Summa Pingbang definitely has an opinion. He and his co-author say, the release of these two movies is not just about their plots or their performances. No, just as the United States lets the world know that at that most dangerous time for humanity, they mean World War II, it bore burdens and made sacrifices, so China has finally dared to propagate in the same way the idea that during the war, China also bore burdens and made sacrifices. And then they finish off with a little concluding sentence, which is, this represents another type of continuity of the competition over politics, economics, and culture of these two countries. So pause there for a moment. Now, I started with these two movies, and I'll mention one or two other movies and TV shows before we finish this part of the commentary today. But I think that last comment from these Chinese blogs, which remind you dates from 11 years ago now, it's pretty prescient in many ways. It's still, you know, it could really have been written yesterday morning, because we know that if there's one geopolitical story that really matters in the world today, it is the US-China competition on technology, on geopolitics, on alliances, whatever it might be. These are the two single nation states which are going to make the running for at least the next decade and probably more. And that phrasing in that blog, I'll just read you that sentence once more, a continuity of the competition over politics, economics, and culture of these two countries. That sums up really neatly what the big story is in terms of the US and China and their relationship with each other, what at least one Chinese leader has called a new type of great power relationship. So what do I want to say about this issue today? Well, I hope to convince you by the end of my comments, if briefly, that there is at least one way of looking at this competition that I think is really important in China. And I'm aware that many people watching this talk today are our Oxford students from China. So feel free to tell me if you agree or disagree. And that is the way in which the changing collective memory and understanding of the World War II period, the period known in China as the War of Resistance against Japan, Kangzhan, is a significant shaper of China's international relations, particularly in the early 21st century. And to give an example of what I mean by that, let me just give one particular example that came to mind from less than a year ago, which was from the Munich Security Conference, big international conference, a bit like sort of Davos, but for more kind of geopolitical security issues. And at that meeting, Wang Yi, the foreign minister of China, then as he is now, said to the assembled company, including the then Secretary of Defense of the United States, Mark Esper, and the then Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, you should not forget, and when he said you, he meant the whole hall, but I think he was particularly talking to the Americans, I have to say. He said, you should not forget that in 1945, China was not just a signatory to the new United Nations Charter, it was the first signatory. In other words, China laying claim to one of the legacies of the Second World War. Actually, technically speaking, the Second World War hadn't even finished when the various powers, including China, the US, Britain, and the Soviet Union, put together and signed the Charter of the United Nations as major powers in April to June of 1945. So Wang Yi was recalling this moment and pointing out that China wasn't just laying claim to being a member of the international community that emerged in 1945 at the end of World War II, but that China also has a claim to be a founder member of that particular order. Now, this is a change, because if you think about what China said about itself, even 20 years ago, which is a long time for most people watching this, because you probably weren't even born at that stage, but for some of us, it's a time that we can remember. That was a point at which 1949, in other words, the victory of Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party he led on the Chinese mainland against the Kuomintang, or Chinese nationalists under Jiang Jieshi, Chiang Kai-shek. That was the dividing point from the old world to the new world. And in many ways, of course, it still is. Even now, you'll hear plenty of discussion in China of that period as being Jianguo, the foundation of the state. But now, there's another date in town when it comes to geopolitics, 1945, one which is much more familiar to the rest of the world because, of course, it is the end point of World War II. And that's very mainstream when we think about where the old world and the new world divide for the United States, for Britain, for France, for Germany, for Japan, for almost every important country that was on one side or the other in World War II. But until recently, it has not been true for China. Not never, but hardly as one of the most important dates in terms of China's definition of itself at home and international society. And what I've done with the book is to try and demonstrate that in all sorts of different ways, everything from the way in which the southwestern city of Chongqing, the old wartime capital of China during those years, has sought to reinvent itself, to the discussions that go on in kind of online internet battles between the so-called Guofen and Maofen, fans of the Kuomintang and fans of Mao Zedong online. In all of these areas, World War II continues to shape the way that different language is used in China about identity. But I'm not going to have time to go through all of those today, so I'm going to stick to one, and that is the way in which changing views of World War II are changing China's international position, its engagement with the wider world. And I want to go back in a minute to some images to show you how that's being done. But before we do that, let me first say that this idea, the sense of China as a creator of a new post-World War order, comes also from a wider discovery in China itself in the last few decades of its own World War II experience, one which is still not well known in the outside world. So a quick reminder for those who I hope might know something about this. China suffered very greatly during World War II. It was the longest single Allied power to fight in the war between 1937 and 1945. More than 10 million, possibly more than 14 million Chinese civilians and military were killed during that Second World War period. 100 million Chinese became refugees in their own country during that time as well. And much of the infrastructure of China, roads, railways, all of that was smashed into pieces during that period. But in addition, it's worth noting that for the early period of that war, from 1937 to 1941, China, almost on its own, not quite, but almost on its own, both its Kuomintang nationalist leaders under Chiang Kai-shek, Jiang Jieshi, and also their reluctant but nonetheless important allies, the Chinese communists under Mao Zedong, fought back against an invader and held back over 500,000 Japanese troops in Chinese territory until the Americans and the British arrived after Pearl Harbor in December 1941. So it's a very substantial, significant event in Chinese history, the Second World War. But unlike other countries which were also devastated by it, it hasn't appeared much in global understanding of that particular conflict. And there are a variety of reasons for that. One is that basically after 1949, because of the political opposition between the Chinese nationalists who have had to flee to Taiwan and the Chinese communists, it became very difficult to talk about any Kuomintang nationalist contribution to the victory in World War II. And that began to change only in the 1980s. But that change in the 1980s is a very important turning point in this wider story of China taking back possession of World War II and its legacy in defining itself. And one of the people involved, I'm going to go back to screen sharing, see if I can make that work, is this gentleman here. Where are we? Okay. So this is Hu Qiaomu, one of the most prominent, senior, quite hardcore figures in the Chinese Communist Party, personal secretary to Mao Zedong. He was present in the great kind of wartime capital at Yan'an, very, very dedicated, very, very hardcore, you might say, member of the Chinese Communist leadership for all of his life, which, as you see from those dates, was a pretty lengthy life. So in other words, someone who was absolutely at the center of the Chinese Communist project, you might say. But he survived on into the reform era after the death of Mao in 1976. And one thing that he did was to set China on the path to thinking that its understanding of its global position had to go beyond simply the history of the Chinese Communist Party itself. What do I mean by that? Let me read you a little bit from something by this gentleman, Hu Qiaomu. Where are we? Here we are. Okay, so in 1987, Hu Qiaomu wrote an editorial in the People's Daily, the Renmin Ribao, the most official, then and now, most official kind of source, top-level leadership source that you can possibly imagine in China. And he wrote about what he called the immense significance of World War II in China. Immense significance? Why so significant? Well, let's hear the words of the man himself in my translation, admittedly. So, Hu Qiaomu said in this editorial, a great significance of the war of resistance against Japan is that it fundamentally changed the international politics of East Asia. Before the conclusion of the 8 years of our war against Japan, Japanese imperialism was on the rampage. But then he does a little sort of run through what happens next. He said, but in 1945, the Soviet army eliminated the Japanese army and entered Korea. Then the atomic bombings ended the war. And then the defeated Japanese adopt their peace constitution, which they of course still have today, which forbids aggressive warfare. And new powers, including of course China, sat in judgment on Japan at the so-called Tokyo trials, the International Military Tribunal of the Far East, the war crimes trials in Asia. So he goes through all of this history. And then Hu Qiaomu reaches at the end of this paragraph, the end point of this teleology of how things have changed. And he wrote, just a year later, meaning 1949, the People's Republic of China declared its foundation. The old China, which was called the sick man of East Asia, would not return. At the same time, he added the old structure of East Asia and the old structure of the world would not return. So in other words, having previously essentially dismissed the end of World War II as not really being a kind of moment of any great significance, it's now taken back into ownership by the Chinese Communist Party as a means of setting the stage for their eventual victory. And Hu's statement that a large part of World War II's significance was to do with international order, remember that term, we're going to stick with that, was important for framing World War II as a point of origin for the contemporary international system, which China, of course, was grappling with in the 1980s. And this triggered off a whole range of interest in World War II during this period. And from the 1990s onwards, you can see in China that various much more broad interpretations of the wartime period began to become more mainstream, including a much more open embrace, or at least admission, of the contribution made to the war effort against the Japanese by the Communist Party's old enemy, the Kuomintang, the nationalists, as well as by the communists themselves. But there was a wider purpose, which was to try and find new ways to add historical weight to territorial claims and other claims that China wanted to make and wants to make in the present tense in the modern world. So let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Let's fast forward a quarter of a century from that essay by Hu Qiaomu in 1987. Let's turn instead to November 2013, so just over 7 years ago. Now, at that point, there was widespread Chinese media reporting of the 70th anniversary of the Cairo Conference, an event which had taken place in November 1943. What was this event? Well, it was the only event, or the only wartime conference during World War II at which the Chinese side was represented. And let's have a look at that. There we are. So a very nice snap of it there. We have the great wartime leaders of World War II. We have President Franklin D. Roosevelt in the middle. We have Prime Minister Winston Churchill. And flanked on either side, on the left-hand side of the picture, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, the Chinese nationalist leader and globally recognized leader of China at the time. And on the other side, Sung Meiling, the Madame Chiang Kai-shek, the wife of Chiang and a fluent speaker of English, who was essentially his kind of spokesperson to the world, you might say. So this conference was clearly one of some significance at the time. You know, it was sort of marked China having a greater role in the war effort. But why on earth remember it with such enthusiasm 70 years later? Well, let me explain why. So much of the Chinese media coverage of that time basically focused not on the personnel at the conference, but the statement, the communique that had been made at the end in November 1943, which contains the following lines. Points in so they're talking about after the war ends, which hadn't happened in 1943, but they knew it would happen within a few years. And they said, points in Japanese territory to be designated by the Allies shall be occupied to secure the achievement of the basic objectives we are here setting forth. And the next line is the killer. The terms of the Cairo Declaration shall be carried out, and Japanese sovereignty shall be limited to the islands of Honshu, Hokkaido, Kyushu, Shikoku, and such minor islands as we determine. Right, that phrasing has been used by a variety of Chinese international lawyers, political thinkers, think tankers, and so forth, to argue that China's particular territorial claims on some islands, which are midway in the East China Sea. Japanese currently have control, they call them the Senkaku Islands. China wants control, they call them the Diaoyu Islands. Taiwan, also the Republic of China, wants control, and they call them the Diaoyutai. So these islands are heavily contested. Today, I am not going to make any statement whatsoever about the who is right and who is wrong in this claim. That's not my business, and I don't have the expertise to put it forward. But what I will say, is that there is clearly a strong use by China of this historical context of the World War II conference to make the case that it's China's claims that should be respected over Japan. And that means that without acknowledging it, the Chinese Communist Party is essentially taking on a Kuomintang nationalist claim and making it part of their own case, which is something that I think both Mao Zedong and Jiang Jieshi would have found historically quite ironic in certain ways. And that use of World War II as a way of making claims about the present day isn't limited just to that kind of what's sometimes called lawfare, which is use of international law to try and push your own territorial claims. Another image, I think, shows a different use, but I think a very interesting one, of that Cairo conference. So let me go back to that. Oh, there we are. Yes. So in 2015, for the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II, a Chinese movie studio actually made this movie, Kailo Xuanyuan, the Cairo Declaration, which was basically a dramatized version of that event. So you can see that some of the characters are the same. The guy who plays Winston Churchill, by the way, who's got a bow tie, is actually an American. So for English speakers, it's quite fun watching it and hearing Winston Churchill with an American accent. I guess they couldn't be bothered to actually pay any money to pay an Englishman to do it. And it's interesting seeing these other characters, you know, Stalin and others back in the background. However, one of the things that's a bit weird about this collection of people, as you see, is right in the middle, we have an actor playing Mao Zedong, the Chinese communist leader, major historical figure, but just a reminder, he was not at Cairo. That guy sitting on the left-hand side is definitely Chiang Kai-shek. And yet here, it's Mao Zedong. Now, I'm sure all of you who know something about the Chinese internet will know that even though the internet there is quite controlled in all sorts of ways that we know, people also have a good sense of humor. And when this poster came out for this movie, a lot of people in China said, come on, guys, you know, this is a bit silly, having Mao Zedong rather than Jiang Jieshi on the movie poster. And so they came up with a whole variety of alternative versions of the Cairo Declaration poster, of which these are some of my favorites. Other people who were not at Cairo in 1943, but made it onto the poster, and you take your pick there of Saddam Hussein, Kim Jong-un, Jack Ma, so maybe when he disappeared the other day, that's where he went, Barack Obama, looking a bit spaced out, and Colonel Gaddafi of Libya. You know, eventually the makers of the movie got a bit embarrassed, and they reissued the poster saying that they were, you know, not trying to make a big political point. But the wider issue, I think, is an important one, which is that this movie was also being produced as part of a kind of popular culture push to also argue that this moment, the Cairo Declaration, was a moment when China became a global actor, and that as well as making sacrifices and having responsibilities, China should also be given the benefits and rewards of having made that particular set of sacrifices. There's a line in the movie where President Franklin Roosevelt says, China has become a responsible great power, which I think is not a phrase that President Roosevelt ever used in his life, but it's certainly a phrase that's been used by various Chinese thinkers and geostrategists in the 2010s to describe China's present day behavior. So the film is in some ways quite a sort of metaphorical statement about China now, rather than China back in the 1940s. Okay, so that's kind of one of the more popular culture emergences of World War II. But just a little reminder as I bring it along that there are all sorts of other ways in which World War II has been much more explicitly and centrally brought into the way that Chinese public culture thinks about some of these issues. So here's one which I actually attended. In fact, I got to comment on it for CCTV, which was quite interesting. The Victory Parade of 3rd of September 2015, held in Tiananmen, where for the first time, and so far the last time, the Chinese state put together a massive parade in the most prestigious site you can imagine in China, the middle of Tiananmen in the center of Beijing, not for an event specifically to do with the People's Republic or the Communist Party, but commemorating the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II. That was pretty unprecedented, as was something that happened in the middle, in between all the soldiers marching and the tanks and missiles, all of that. A very moving moment, actually, when several Laobing veterans of the Second World War were presented to President Xi Jinping. Half of them were from the former communist armies, like the 8th Route Army, the Balujin, and half were from the Kuomintang armies, the nationalist armies. And it was a sort of moment of reconciliation that this huge fissure, this huge split, this breach between the communists and nationalists, which of course was expressed in the Civil War of 1946 to 49, not explicitly, but by very strong implication, was being sort of, moved past by this particular gesture. So that was a very, very interesting moment for historians of China to witness. And other aspects of that wartime and post-war settlement continue to be important. And I'm not going to go into the rights and wrongs of any of these, but just to point them out, 1947, part of the Kuomintang post-war claims have now been very much taken up by today's CCP in China on their claims on the South China Sea, which of course is one of China's most lively international disputes at the moment. Or indeed, some other cases where actually, just to provide a bit of contrast, there is a reversal, you might say, of some of these trends. Because one thing I've also learned is that not every single World War II analogy or metaphor necessarily serves the purpose of China today. And one that I was most surprised by, because it's one that most Westerners would have thought would go down really well, actually went down very badly. What am I talking about? Okay. Everyone here, I'm sure, has heard of Idailu, the One Belt, One Road, Belt and Road Initiative, very, very famous. This big economic infrastructure plan that China is rolling out over years and decades. Now, when it first started out, about 7 or 8 years ago, a lot of Westerners, and actually a few quite senior Chinese, referred to this as the new Marshall Plan, and they were talking about the kind of spending of money to provide this huge kind of infrastructural boost. Now, if you're from the West, even if you're not from the West, if you're Chinese, you'll know that the Marshall Plan is a very, very, for most people, it's pretty well regarded. It's regarded as a sort of act of great statesmanship by the United States to reconstruct post-war Europe. And so many people would think that actually this is fantastic free publicity for China, that it's getting this incredibly complimentary nickname from Westerners about the BRI plan. China's Marshall Plan, isn't that great? Not at all. It was made very clear by Chinese media that they did not accept this particular naming. This post-war Marshall Plan for Europe was basically rejected as a label. And I've got in the book various editorials saying Belt and Road Initiative is no Marshall Plan of China. Why not? Well, a couple of reasons. One is that Marshall himself, of course, General George C. Marshall, was the man, one of the men who won World War II. He was certainly the savior of Europe, but of course he was the architect of a failed peace plan in China in 1946, which ended with him not only failing to reconcile the nationalists and the communists, but essentially having to leave China, pretty depressed and being insulted by both sides actually as he disappeared. So his name does not by any means have the sort of cachet in that Chinese context that it did in the European one. But the reason I found it interesting is that in this particular case, China, as we know, has been trying to find sort of favorable analogies and metaphors for most of its global actions for years and years and years to create a sort of soft power. And it seemed to me ironic but interesting that the one occasion when actually almost unearned, a very powerful soft power label emerged, this Marshall Plan idea, that was the one idea that China's collective media decided, and of course the party decided that they could not accept. So that's a sort of historical irony, I would say. But overall, World War II has become, I think, a really important touchstone in the way that China thinks about itself. And I'll finish off, if I may, by explaining why I think that's important in terms of the context of the title that I gave this book, because the title, China's Good War, may seem a bit counterintuitive, a bit ironic. It is meant to be ironic. It's taken actually as a reference to a great book about the United States, The Good War by Studs Terkel, which is a wonderful oral history published in the 1980s of veterans of World War II. And the title was meant ironically because although the war had done much good, the individual experiences of people, the death, the suffering was clearly appalling. And in many cases, even in America, many of the evils that existed beforehand at home, such as racial discrimination against African-American soldiers, continued to be the case. So in the same sort of way, with this, I'm gesturing to the fact that in some ways, the World War II that China talks about today is a sort of constructed version of that, which gives China a sort of mythology, a sort of narrative about being a purposeful, ethical actor in the world, and a link between the past and the present. The idea that back then, China was part of the global anti-fascist alliance, which it absolutely was, and that for that reason, or amongst other reasons, this reason being one of them, that China today should be given a break and taken on trust in terms of having a moral standing for its growing presence in East Asia. Now, World War II is by no means the only strand of thinking that China uses to put this message forward. It uses the Belt and Road Initiative and its economic rolling out of infrastructure. These days it's using vaccine diplomacy and anti-COVID diplomacy, and a wider argument about being a leader of the global South that doesn't have to follow Western norms. But World War II is part of that mix as well. China's good war, in that sense, the war that makes China think about its role as a moral actor in the world. And for that reason, I think it's important that the wider world understands that and gets to understand why it's become such a source of resonance in China at a whole variety of levels, whether it's China's top leaders, or as I've mentioned, just various people, keyboard warriors, phone warriors, basically swapping ideas about World War II between themselves on their phones, which is also a frequently found and in some ways just as important part of the mixture. Okay, thanks very much, Nick-Eric and Idror. I will stop the share at that point and turn back to you if we want to take a bit of time, 20 minutes or so, for some questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Rana. It was a really interesting talk, and you provided really good insight to your book. And based on this, I have a few questions I would like to ask you before I hand over to Idror. The first question is, you started your talk talking about individual experiences, and probably also mentioned slightly how individual Chinese citizens might remember the Second World War through their families or other relatives. Could you just quickly reiterate how exactly that feeds into the main narrative the Chinese government is trying to construct, besides the main efforts of promoting their image they have through articles such as the one by Hu Jiao or through other media outlets?
Yeah, thanks. It's a really interesting question, Nick-Eric. In the round and in the wider context, I think it's really important to understand that this is not just, or even primarily, about top-down sort of propaganda from above. I have to say, choosing the international relations side of things, it is more in that direction, because obviously diplomacy tends to take place at a pretty elite level, and so the opportunity for kind of popular input is not that great. But many of the other chapters of the book deal with much more grassroots sorts of phenomena and cultural phenomena too. So to give you a few examples of how that might be, well, actually, I'll give you one, because I think it provides sort of the opposite end of the spectrum. And that is the way in which people, particularly in formerly nationalist areas of China, i.e. areas that were not under communist control in the war, had to wait decades and decades, but finally were given leeway to tell their own stories about fleeing as refugees during the wartime period. They were evacuees. And because they hadn't evacuated to the communist areas, but the nationalist areas, for a very long time, they were not able to tell their own stories. And they were really into their sort of 70s and 80s before it became possible. I mean, again, I'm just looking at my shelf here and see if I can pull it off the shelf at this, but yeah, there it is. So some of you may know or know of this book, which I write about a bit, and for those who don't read Chinese, it's called Going to the Interior. In other words, it's about refugees who made their way from eastern China up to Chongqing, the nationalist capital. And it's basically just a wonderful collection of oral histories and stories about what it was like, during those terrible years. But, one of the interviewers was told by the subject, who was in his 80s by then, "I'm not afraid of dying, people do die, but I was terrified about our stories not being preserved to tell to the next generation. So that's a very, very different place from the idea of a top-down, Beijing-driven propaganda effort to try and tell a particular authorized story of World War II, but with a bit more leeway for other actors to come into it. And I think the fact that these coexist and interact with each other and feed off each other is a really interesting part of the phenomenon. So it's very multifaceted.
Thank you. My next question would be, when you were talking about the 2015 parade on Tiananmen Square in the center of Beijing, you also mentioned that this was seen as an element of reconciliation between the Kuomintang and the Gongchenlang, so the communists and the nationalists. Could you perhaps, would you say this is also used then, of course, in international diplomacy as an effort to increase the pressure of Beijing on Taiwan, on especially the Taiwanese government to fit into the One China policy, especially since now that the Kuomintang are no longer in power?
I think 2015 was a very particular moment. Firstly, because of the 70th anniversary, and second, because, as you've indicated there, at that time, the administration on Taiwan was led by Ma Ying-jeou, who was, probably the single closest Taiwan leader to the mainland that there's been. He's the only one who's actually met Xi Jinping. They met in Singapore after he left office. So, that was clearly much closer to a sort of authorized statement. I think it's been more difficult since the election of the DPP to use this particular discourse for one quite simple reason. The DPP does not stress the commonality of Taiwan with the mainland in a way that the Kuomintang did. They stress its separateness. And many of them pointed out, in the context of World War II, rather mordantly, that many Taiwanese did indeed fight in World War II, but they fought on behalf of the Japanese because they were a Japanese colony at the time. And that level of complexity is quite uncomfortable for, the discourses on both sides. So to that extent, I would say that this particular discourse, I think it's become, it's remained very powerful in all sorts of ways, including forging this narrative of China as a sort of founder of the 1945 world. That continues to be strong. But in terms of the cross-straits relationship, I think 2015 may have been, at least up to now, the high point of that. And it's becoming, more divergent rather than less.
Okay, thank you. With this, my first questions are concluded, and I would hand over to Ijo to ask her questions.
Sure.
Thank you, Mika. So I would like to first ask a question about China's official narrative of the World War II history. So what kind of messages, in your perspective, were conveyed by the CCP when they changed the official understanding of World War II history against the Japanese from 8 years to 14 years? So by changing from 8年抗战 to 14年抗战, and moving the timeline 7 years early, so from 1937 to 1931, actually 6 years, sorry. So what kind of messages are conveyed?
Really, I've got a section about that in the book, in fact, and I managed to get some sort of behind the scenes information, about how this came about. So just to explain perhaps to those in the audience who are not so clear about this, the mainstream, including in China itself for many years, was to talk about the Second World War period as the 8年抗战, the 8 years of war of resistance, from 1937, the outbreak of war at the so-called Marco Polo Bridge, Lugoqiao incident, up to the end of war in 1945. But there's always been, or at least for a long time in the post-war period, there had been an alternative historical interpretation which argued that really the Manchurian incident, 9/18, the 18th September 1931, when Japanese coup essentially launched an invasion of the northeastern provinces of China, then known as Manchuria, that was really the beginning of the war. Now, you can have, and there is still, I think, kind of strong debate about this in most historical circles, certainly outside China. I think most historians of this period outside China in the West would still stick to the 8-year interpretation. But basically, there wasn't an official position taken on it till 2017, I think it was, or 2018, when the Chinese government announced that, for the point of view of textbooks and official purposes, 14 years, 1931 to 1945, no argument on that. And it was an example, actually, from what I've gathered, of how a sort of set of debates which are perhaps more political than historical took place behind the scenes. And lots of things were involved, but one of them, I think, was basically the desire of that region today, Dongbei, the northeastern part of China, to get more sort of meritorious treatment for its wartime experience. It was occupied years before the rest of China. And yet, in some ways, I think it was arguing that its experience of occupation didn't properly count in that particular case. So I think there was plenty of debate from all accounts back and forth, including amongst historians. But I think once the decision had been made, essentially it became an official edict. And I've even seen, previous mentions of the Banyan being changed to Shisenye. But I would say that it is something that essentially is making a political statement. It's an interpretation which certainly exists for some historians, but the space to actually dispute it is much harder to find now within China itself. And outside China, it's not used very much as an interpretation in the West. It's slightly closer, interesting enough, to the leftist view in Japan, which has talked for a very long time about the Jugonen Senso, the 15-year war. I never quite know how they got 1931 to 45 to be 15 years, but anyway, for whatever reason, in a sense, it's closer to a Japanese position than a Western position, which, if you like, is a kind of irony.
Thank you. So my next question would be regarding COVID. So China is commonly known as the first country to experience an outburst of COVID and has taken very harsh measurements towards containing it. So although this intransparency and brutal treatments has been heavily criticized by the Western world, China is now one of the few countries to control the pandemic while bring down infection rates. So what role do you think does this narrative of nationalism play in China's fight with coronavirus?
Well, actually, the World War II metaphor that I've mentioned has been really important, because I was able to send the final kind of proofs of the book before it went to press to get in what was just happening in China at that time, which was the use of the analogy of People's War, 人民战争, which, again, those who know Chinese history will know, was used by Mao in the 1930s to talk about the war against the Japanese. Essentially, the People's War against the Japanese in the 30s was now being repurposed as the People's War against the virus in 2020. So that wartime metaphor, yet again, proved to be a kind of powerful one in terms of that argument. In terms of the wider nationalism, I think it's absolutely fair to say that the party is pushing very hard in terms of using, what I know is a quite clear normalization of much of life within China. And I say this because, I've been Zooming with various graduate students who are back in China at the moment, and they seem to be spending lots of time in restaurants and stores and other things that are not open in the West as well. I would be intrigued to see quite what happens in the near future, because, of course, one of the things we're all discovering is that as long as you keep your borders closed, there's some capacity, even in a very big country like China, to sort of control what goes on. But once the borders open again, it's quite hard to do that. The UK is currently going through this dilemma, I think. And since there are an awful lot of people in China who will need the vaccine when it's rolled out, I think there are some interesting questions about how that sort of nationalism develops at a time when China will be one way or another actually keeping itself quite closed off from the rest of the world. Even if officially you can get to China from outside, being forced to stay in a quarantine hotel for 2 weeks is not, for most people, a very attractive or viable prospect. So I think that China at the moment is going to be a place that, in a sense, is more inward looking in terms of that discourse for a while, because the normal expectation that Chinese would be heading outside and outsiders would be coming in probably won't hold for, I'm guessing, a year at least, maybe longer.
Thank you. And my last question would be regarding the US-China relationship.
Mm.
So in your previous interview with the Foreign Correspondent Club Hong Kong, you mentioned that if the Biden administration takes over the power, which he did in the election, it would be easier for him to come up with a new way of dealing with the undergoing confrontation. So observing what happened in the past months, do you still hold the same view? And what's your prediction on the future of US-China relation?
Well, if I had a kind of reliable prediction, I think I would be much more powerful and much better connected than I am. Yeah, I mean, I think the first signs are pretty much what we would have expected, which is that the kind of very confrontational language of the Trump administration has been dialed down. But overall, I think it's fair to say that any US government is going to have a more kind of power realist view of the relationship with China, just as China is having a much more kind of realist view of the way in which it can exercise its growing power in the wider world. I suspect, you asked what I expect. I think that I think that the interesting place to look will be what you might call the ungoverned spaces of the world. So I think somewhere like the Indian Ocean space is going to be very interesting because it's not somewhere that has been traditionally under any one superpower's control. You know, the Atlantic is an American lake. The Pacific has been divided between the Americans and the Chinese. The Indian Ocean has traditionally not really been dominated by anyone, including the Indians. But now that the PLA Navy has blue water capacity, I think that is a subject of great interest to India, to the United States, to Australia, to Japan, and initiatives such as the so-called Quad, in other words, kind of the formulation of new alliances, which are, I think, at least in part, to keep a very wary eye on what's going on with China. That's going to become more commonplace. And I think that it's not clear to me necessarily either where the Western allies are going to go with that, but actually, I'm not yet entirely clear whether China knows quite how it wants to play that either. So I think there's all to play for on that front.
Right, thank you. So I'll hand over back to Mika.
Sure.
Thank you very much, Ijo. I'm just going to start with one question which was posted in the comments on Facebook.
Sure.
With regards conferences such as the one in Cairo, how come the Chinese government or one of the various governments in China at the time was only invited, were they invited to multiple conferences and just couldn't attend, or was it rather the case that they weren't invited to many of these conferences?
Good question. Well, if you want to know more about that, please do pick up a copy of my book, China's War with Japan, which is a history of China's role in World War II, which talks about it in much more detail. The short answer is no, they were only invited to that one conference, but actually that was an important symbolic moment because prior to that, you know, China had been a sort of semi-colonized country which had no capacity to sit equally with the American president or the British prime minister. But in the end, the issue was that China was an ally that was important in terms of tying Japanese down, but it wasn't able to make kind of independent strategic decisions in the way that the Soviet Union, the United States, and the British Empire were able to do. So to that extent, the vast majority of the other conferences involved those leaders. And one other factor to remember, until the very last days of the war, August 1945, the Soviet Union was not an actor in World War II in Asia. It was neutral, which meant that Stalin, as you see in the picture, could not appear at the Cairo conference. And in fact, just a couple of weeks later, the same leaders turned up at Tehran. Roosevelt and Churchill turned up at Tehran without Chiang, but with Stalin there, and promptly reversed many of the strategic decisions that had been made at Cairo. So I would say that although China was given equal standing, there's no doubt that it was being treated as a junior partner, and there's no doubt from Chiang Kai-shek's diaries, which historians have been able to read, that Chiang knew that and bitterly resented it, but still saw it overall as a raising of China's status in the world to have appeared at the conference in the first place.
Thank you. Another question would be, this is a personal one. Given that China wasn't as greatly involved in World War I as it was in World War II, but still supported the effort in France especially, and because there were quite a few colonies in China, there was also quite a lot of conflict going on, some of the Asian conflict happening there as well. Just a quick question, how is World War I remembered in contrast to World War II in China?
Yeah, no, interesting question. It's not greatly remembered, it has to be said, except in one particular aspect I'll mention in a moment. There's some great writing on it. It's not something I've done research on, but Xu Guoqi at Hong Kong University has written 2 or 3 wonderful books on China and World War I. And essentially, it was an important event. More than 100,000 Chinese workers went to the Western Front, digging trenches, working behind the lines, but in very dangerous conditions. And many of them died there as well. So China made a very significant contribution. The aspect which is remembered is not so much the Chinese participation in the war, but the aftermath, and particularly the aftermath that took place on a date that Chinese viewers will know what I'm talking about, Wu Si. In other words, May 4th. 4th of May, 1919, 5 days after the signing of the Versailles Treaty, 30th of April, 1919, at the end of the conference, when essentially some of China's key territorial interests, which had been handed over to the Germans, were not given back to China, but handed to Japan instead. And it led to this huge nationalistic wave of, outraged young patriotic Chinese who said, look, this is intolerable. And the whole era gives rise to a kind of variety of radical political movements. So you could very strongly argue that essentially it's the aftermath of World War I that gives rise to the May 4th movement. But the May 4th movement becomes much bigger than just being about the end of the war. It's really about China's renewal of itself and its search for, these famous qualities, 在线上, 的线上, Mr. Science, Mr. Democracy.
Thank you. Another question from the comments. I'm wary we're running out of time, but I would just want to ask you for a few
We can
more
go a couple of minutes, so that's fine.
Thank you. So another question from the comments focuses more on the view China has of Europe in this context of World War II, because as you said earlier, it's mostly seen as the war of resistance against the Japanese, and not necessarily the war in Europe, just as the war in Europe is not necessarily seen as a war in Asia. And in this case, how are the Western powers seen in popular and official narratives forming a major part at all? And is this also somewhat related to current Chinese attitudes towards Europe and also to some part of the United States?
So how are Western powers seen in today's Chinese discourse about the war?
Exactly.
Yeah. Variably, I think, is the answer to that. The vast majority of Chinese discussion with the historical or in popular culture about foreigners in China during World War II is about the Americans, largely because the Americans sent a large amount of money, and they sent prominent figures, including General Joseph Stilwell, to be chief of staff to Chiang Kai-shek's troops. The British did send staffers and other people too, but it was a slightly lesser sort of participation. And it's worth remembering that none of these soldiers were being sent as ground troops. The war in China was fought by Chinese troops and Japanese troops, obviously, as well as, of course, some Chinese troops who fought on the Japanese side as well, so-called Hantian, collaborators. But in terms of the kind of substantial support, including from the air, the Americans were an important factor. And I would say that that is something that has been quite widely remembered in the last 20, 30 years. It's sort of downplayed a bit when relations with America are bad, which they are at the moment. But it's not been ignored or cut out of the picture in a way that was true under Mao. The other European actor, if you want to put it that way, who has been sort of revived in recent years is the Soviets, who actually provided not really volunteer, but theoretically volunteer fighter pilots at the beginning of the war in 1937. And that contribution is remembered in official museums and so forth quite prominently now as well. Beyond that, you're right that I think that the specifics of the French or German or Italian wars are not really a very extensive part of the Chinese discourse about the conflict, which, of necessity is mostly about the Chinese role itself.
But then just as a quick follow-up question, do you think that could change given that, with the with the Belt and Road Initiative, China is slowly also expanding within the European Union in Italy, for example? And do you think that they might utilize their narrative of World War II with a closer perspective to Europe to have some legitimacy for their goals?
I don't think they're very likely to use a narrative of World War II because by definition, many of the countries they're dealing with were on the losing side in World War II. I think it's fair to say. I think it's more useful in terms of the United Nations, where it's about a foundation myth of who was there at the beginning. I don't mean myth in the sense of untruth, because of course it is perfectly true that China was indeed a key signatory to the UN Charter. Myth in the sense of creating a sort of wider narrative that helps to boost your political agenda. I think, to be honest, one of the difficulties in terms of EU-China relations has been that it's very hard to find a collective narrative that brings them together, that goes beyond trade, because essentially, the Chinese side wants to talk about trade and development. The European side wants to talk about trade and human rights. And these are not very easy positions to bring together in terms of a discourse, which is why I think that relationship is always much less than the sum of its parts, I think. Which is another reason, by the way, I'm not that overexcited by the CAI, the Comprehensive Agreement on Investments that's recently been signed, which is regarded by some as a great triumph for China, others as a great disaster for Europe. I think actually it's probably less consequential than any of those things suggest, but it doesn't, I think, constrain either side from continuing to behave as they want to do.
Thank you. That you're already taking away my next question, because that was exactly what I wanted to ask you about after, and what you think about this agreement. But then my last question to finish this off with also relates to this agreement, in the sense of what do you think this actually means for the United States' relationship to Europe and to China? Because this is an agreement which was specifically signed between Europe and China, without the United States involved so much. And I think they already signed it at a point when the United States was mostly focused on domestic problems. So do you think that's going to impact the relations between any of these parties in any way?
Honestly, not that much, I don't think. I think it was a source of kind of huge sort of splash and fuss at the beginning of this year, because it was sort of sneaked in, some argued, when Trump was in his last days and all of that sort of business. I think in the end, the fundamental problems are much greater, and they need to be sorted out of places like the WTO, because essentially the US and China have a phase one trade agreement which isn't working at all well. The EU and China, in my opinion, have just signed a comprehensive agreement of investment that actually won't do much to open markets on either side. So what are both quite protectionist economies in certain ways. And unfortunately, it does look, if you look at the example of Australia, that even if you sign a free trade deal with China, CHAFTA is the one there, it doesn't necessarily mean that you actually get preferential treatment. And in fact, it can often be the reverse. So that gave a lot of Europeans, has to be said, a lot of pause for thought about how realistic it was to expect much access off the back of signing the agreement, because of the Australian experience. Obviously, Australia is smaller by far than the EU, but nonetheless, there is this sort of wider sense that maybe actually signing the agreement isn't that big a deal in the end. So I fear that global trade is in for quite a choppy time. We're not in a very happy position when it comes to, along with things like decoupling, withdrawal of global supply chains to try and bring them closer to home, part of which is a product of COVID. Those trends are going to continue for quite a long time, I think.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you so much from both us and the viewers for taking the time today. It was a really intriguing and insightful event.
Sure.
And I'm just going to quickly hand over to Ijo if you also want to say something, but I think otherwise we can conclude it at this point.
Sure.
I think we can conclude, and just thank you so much, Rana, for coming over, and it's been very interesting discussion, and thank you for everyone who's been watching this on Facebook, and thank you for your questions.
Thank you all very much for joining tonight on Zoom and Facebook, or wherever you have been. Pleasure to have your questions, and hope to see you in real life one of these days. But thank you all for hosting and for being here tonight. Good night.
Thank you very much. Good night.